This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. I really look forward to my Tuesday meetings with Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. This is a dose of sanity in a world that is wildly unpredictable and getting crazier by the day. So, Eric, I'll begin as I always do by asking, how are things in your direction?
They're good. And actually, there is something that's predictable. Trump lied again.
You don't say. What was it about this time?
Well, you remember how we were supposedly just mere moments away from a deal that was going to end the war?
Yeah, I think I've heard that a few times now.
Right. Well, once again, apparently not. The war's back on. And I don't think there's any way that it's going to end is the problem. And so, Trump having painted himself and us into this corner, what comes next? It's really worrisome. You and I talked about this a little bit off the air. I think that when a man makes outlandish, braggadocious statements, and then the very next day they're proved to be absurdities, lies and absurdities, he becomes ridiculous. And Trump strikes me as the kind of guy who can't bear to look ridiculous, to look like a clown, to be perceived as the worst thing for him, a loser. And that makes him potentially dangerous, I think. And I believe you agree with me on that assessment.
I'm just going by what I see in his social media messages. They, to me, seem increasingly disconnected from reality and more tapped into that image that he's trying to maintain. And I know it's going to sound, gee, you're hating on Trump. I'm just saying this is not the guy who seems to have a firm grasp of anything at the moment. And that scares me just a little bit because if image really is important, it's like the guy who goes around, the bar running his mouth and challenging everybody to a fight. I promise you, that is not the strongest person in the room. That's not the person who has their stuff together. It's, those kinds of shows, that's almost always compensating for a weakness that they're aware of and they're afraid others may be aware of.
Yeah, certain kinds of lies, I think, are more easily spun. These sort of academic, abstract lies about economic minutia. You'll have some apologist for the administration, whether it's Trump or any other administration, come out and start pointing to numbers and charts. And potentially that's something that people can look at and go, well, yeah, maybe, I guess, even though it feels like I'm really not doing so well financially, maybe it's just me. Maybe, they're right. But when you roll up to the pump and you look at $4.40 for a gallon, Trump's lying when he says, I've lowered gas prices. They're $1.98. He actually said that just the other day. He actually claimed that gas prices are $1.98. You don't have to be particularly sophisticated to recognize the disparity.
Yeah, I'd love to know where that is, but I have a feeling it's somewhere in the Middle East,
Sure.
Probably Saudi Arabia or someplace like that. But, I'm also curious too. You kind of see this same behavior on display with the America 250 celebration, and I know, I think you had written about this too. A number of artists were asked to participate or to perform as part of, the 250th celebration, and they declined to, which, it's their right. Some of them are going to grandstand because, after all, they're pushing back against, whatever political flavor they don't like. But Trump's response kind of left me going, wow, that need to be large and in charge is almost unhealthy.
That's why they bowed out of it. I'm not going to defend a lot of these lefty entertainers, but the point is it was supposed to be a celebration of America's 250th year.
Yes.
Not Trump, not MAGA. And so when it became clear that this was going to be another opportunity for Trump to grandstand, they understandably didn't want to be part of it. I wouldn't want to be part of somebody else's campaign ad. It's illegitimate. If it were simply going to be, hey, this is getting close to the 4th of July. It's America's 250th birthday. Let's play some music and let's talk about how great America is. That's fine, but not how great Trump is. So when the majority of these acts that had been booked decided they didn't want any part of it, he comes out and says, well, America really wants to see the number one act, which is, of course, himself. He actually thinks that people are going to go there to adulate him. And it's at this point, I think it's transcended pathological that he actually thinks of himself that highly. And I don't know offhand, do you know whether the thing is still on or has it been canceled?
I haven't followed it close enough or cared enough to check. I
wonder whether he's going to be dumb enough to continue to have it now when it's just going to be him giving another one of his incoherent monologues to 12 people, outstanding in the audience.
Now, I would like to issue a challenge, and I'm including myself in this challenge, but if you plan on celebrating the 250th, anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I would encourage people really take some time, and I mean unplug and take some time to think about what it is that we're celebrating. I think that there is a lot that is worth celebrating. I believe the principles and the promises on which this nation were founded I think that they're very legit and they're still applicable today. But I don't know that that's what a lot of people are going to be celebrating. I think there's going to be a lot of rah-rah with very little connection to the substance of what exactly was the miracle that happened 250 years ago that would be worthy of celebration today.
Yep, I haven't heard a single person talking about what was asserted then, which was the primacy ultimately of the individual and the illegitimacy of the state. That's what the whole thing was all about. And interestingly enough, it was a secession movement, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The American colonists decided they wanted to secede from Great Britain. You know, that's like the third rail. You're not allowed to say that, but that word is exactly apt because that's exactly what it was. They were not trying to conquer Great Britain. They simply wanted, hey, you guys do you, we're going to do us. We want to be our own thing. Exactly like the Confederate States wanted to do in 1861. Same principle. Unfortunately, the Confederacy lost, which I think was a terrible thing, not because I'm an endorser of slavery. That's such a red herring, but because, like Jefferson, I'm a believer that to the extent possible, decentralizing authority is the way that you avoid tyranny. You know, Jefferson wanted to bring it down to the level of the small community and only delegate the very small handful of things that a local community wasn't competent to handle for itself, such as national defense, and everything else was off the table for the centralized pyramidal structure to dictate to people.
I think one of the great lessons too from the Declaration is that you and I possess natural rights that precede government. Before government is ever called into existence, there are natural rights that are ours by virtue of the fact that we are breathing air and we are human beings, and our natural rights are what limit government power over us. Now, we hear people talk about rights. Well, we've got civil rights and we've got, rights to this and rights to that. Most of those made up rights are the ones that increase our obligations to government. I think Joseph Sobran explained that really well many years ago, but pay close attention when someone starts talking about rights. If in some way it obligates you to do something or to provide something for someone else, that's not a right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to get back to what your original point was, this bellicose, chest thumping, we're the greatest, that's not what the colonists fought for at all. They fought for the things that we are talking about: respect for the individuals and also to the state. A very humbling thing to recognize that you are at best competent to run your own affairs. You are not competent to tell anybody else how to run their affairs.
Hear, hear. And look, it doesn't take, you don't have to have an advanced degree in law or political science or anything like that to understand these kind of things. All you have to have is the willingness to dig deep and obtain moral clarity. And we're just talking right and wrong, not legal versus illegal. That's a good example of where sophistry can kind of take you astray. But Jefferson talked about people being led astray by artificial rules. I think it's a good time to gut check ourselves and make sure, hey, have I been led astray by artificial rules, or do I understand, in my center what is morally right and what is morally wrong? And I think people who take the time to do that are a lot tougher to fool, and they're basically the people you can count on. They won't just go every which way the wind is blowing.
Yes, and it also makes a person less vulnerable to the bloviances of these leaders who, in their arrogance, think that they're essentially omniscient. They've got all the answers, and they're going to tell you what those answers are, and you're going to abide by whatever they tell you those answers are.
Hear, hear. Well, I feel like we got some good clarity there. Now, you told me before we went on the air, there is actually some good news as it pertains to automotive things. Mm-hmm. Tell me the good news.
Well, I've got two. One is that Nissan is not only holding fast with regard to the manual transmission in the Z car, which remains a vehicle that people like you and I could conceivably afford. You can buy one for about $40,000, which, that's still pricey, but it's not out of control pricey. And In addition to that, Lexus has decided they're going to put the kibosh on their, what is the name of this thing? The LFZC. Doesn't that sound like an apartment in the old Soviet Union? That was going to be their flagship EV coming out in 2027. But they very wisely decided to pull the plug. And there are a number of manufacturers, almost every day now you see a news story about car companies deciding to pull the plug on these EVs they had planned to bring out during this model year and the next model year. And that's probably one of the handful of good things that Trump has done, is to take the steam out of this EV push. Having gotten rid of the federal tax rebate, and much more fundamentally, having gotten rid of the regulatory requirements that were serving as a de facto EV mandate. It was very clever the way it was done. They didn't come out and say, you will buy an EV. What they told the car companies was, in order for you to satisfy these regulatory requirements, you basically have to build EVs. It was very sly, very cleverly done. Anyway, Trump, to his credit, did dial back those regulations considerably, and that kind of pulled the rug from under this whole EV thing. And so now they're, the sales are just absolutely cratering everywhere because people don't want them. They're too expensive. They're too impractical. So rather than bleed even more, a lot of car companies are just putting the tourniquet on and saying, okay, we got to stop this. And that's good. I'm happy to see that.
I don't know if I suppose you probably would have known about this before I did, but I didn't realize that Ferrari had made an EV.
They did.
And I was listening to one of my favorite podcasters is Andy Frisella, who has owned a number of Ferraris. He says, I'm not just a fan of supercars and, a car enthusiast. He says, I'm a fanatic. And he was absolutely incensed, that Ferrari, this company with this incredible history of making first race cars and then these supercars, sports cars that, are just like the pinnacle of performance and wow. And he says, and they make this EV, and he just, I can't use the language he was using to describe it, but yeah. he was like, this is the biggest betrayal ever. He says, I don't know if I can ever purchase another Ferrari because they were so stupid. He goes, we don't want, an EV. We don't want, something that's good for the planet. What we want is a screaming V12 that, blows your mind the second you step on the accelerator. Oh, and a manual transmission. He says they got to have that too.
Got to have that. Yeah, I wish I could curse in Italian because it sounds better. Enzo Ferrari is no doubt spinning at 7,000 RPM in his grave over this thing. It's a total debacle. $615,000 is the reported base price for this thing that looks like a wasp-waisted Nissan Leaf and EV. And fundamentally, that's exactly what it is. And that's the point that they continually miss. There is no difference between a Nissan Leaf that costs $28,000 and a Ferrari EV, Ferrari in air fingers quotes, that costs $615,000 or $50,000, however many it is, other than, okay, this one's got a bigger battery. This one can accelerate more rapidly. So it's still the same thing, ultimately. In the article that I wrote about it, I compared it to the Magnum PI era Ferrari 308. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Now, by today's standards of performance, the Ferrari 308 is nothing special. It takes about 7 seconds to get to 60. And, a Toyota Highlander can do that. I mean, that's the performance bar right now. But that car's gorgeous. And just listening to the V8 is magnificent. It's orchestral. And that gated shifter that Ferraris have, that's what makes a Ferrari, not just how powerful it is, not just how quick it is. And this is something that these people just don't seem to get. I tried to explain this to Dodge when they did replace the Charger with this electric car. They canceled the V8 Charger in 2023. And so for 3 years, they tried to shove this battery-powered Charger down people's throats. They even went to the extent, Mercedes did this too, of putting in, for God help us, the soundtrack of the V8 that wasn't there. So that you could sit in this thing and go, like a little kid, like literally like an 8-year-old, push your button, hear the sounds, like remember when you were a kid, the speak and spell, hear the duck, hear the cow, it's infantile and it's insulting. And it's also a confession. If this thing is so great as an EV, why is it that you have to make it sound like it has an engine? Why is that?
No,
so they kept trying to put lipstick on a pig because they kept thinking that we're going to have to sell these things because the government is going to continue to push and mandate them. Well, now that the mandate is gone, it's impossible for them to push these things out there. Though in Ferrari's case, they already had the thing out. So I guess they decided, well, here it is. Because, it takes several years to design, develop, and prove a car before you can bring it out and get it ready to sell. So they got it. Well, I guess we're going to bring it out there and see what happens. And it was a huge mistake. They have done such damage to the Ferrari brand. I think it's on par with what Dylan Mulvaney did to the Bud Light brand. It's that bad. Who wants to be associated with this?
No, I'm with you there. It's, I would wager that the Magnum PI Ferrari probably was in direct competition with the Farrah Fawcett poster in terms of the amount of lust generated by young people who were like aspiring to one day, I'm going to have a car like that. And, there's the EV thing. It's so interesting how without the government pushing it on people, the market doesn't naturally flow there. There's an economic lesson for anybody who's paying attention. What the market wants, it will go after.
At that price point in particular, an ironic thing about the Ferrari story, I don't know whether you were aware of this, but Ferrari and a number of other very high-end manufacturers were looking at making what they called green carbon neutral fuels through this process that, essentially it would make gasoline without any carbon, okay? They were talking about $20 a gallon for that stuff. But, if you can afford to spend $300,000 on a high-end sports car, you can afford to pay $20. In other words, they did get it once. They did understand that people who have that kind of money and are looking for that experience, the Ferrari experience, the Lamborghini experience, that's what they want. They don't want basically the same experience that the guy who buys the $28,000 Nissan Leaf gets. And in particular, they don't want to sit at a Sheetz, for half an hour while their device trickle charges with the proletariat walking by.
By the way, I have to share this with you because this was a really frustrating experience akin to powering up an EV. I went to gas up the other day, and I don't know if it was I'm sure the faulty gas pump had something to do with this. It was taking forever. I'm like 10 minutes to fill my car. And then when it did, for some reason, it didn't trip the overflow sensor. And suddenly a guy with a German accent says, you're spilling fuel on the ground. Oh, crap. I stop, and sure enough, there's about a gallon of fuel on the ground under my wife's Honda. But that little 10-minute interlude, as I'm sitting there looking at the pump and going, really? Why is this taking so long? Just cemented in my mind why I just couldn't commit to an EV, which is more like 30 minutes for a fast charge and an hour or more?
For a partial charge. That'll get you, maybe half of the battery capacity in about a half an hour or so. And it's not just like, okay, maybe once a week, which would be intolerable, I think, for 9 out of 10 people. But typically, if you actually use the thing every day, because their ranges generally are pretty modest, most of them get maybe 300 miles best case. So for most people who use their vehicle every day to get to and fro and go to work, you'd have to do this at least 2 or 3 times a week. Can you imagine? 2 or 3 times a week having to sit there for a half hour, twiddling your thumbs. In what world is that a viable proposition?
Yeah, it just doesn't fly. And by the way, speaking of gas, talk to me about the gasohol pushers. I know that people have wondered sometimes, well, some of this says it has no ethanol or whatever. They don't think about it because they're just there to put fuel in their car. But let's talk about why that difference matters.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You and I can remember that term, gasohol, which was current. Go back to the 70s and the 80s when it first came out. And it was an honest term because, it referred to what it was, which meant, it was gasoline adulterated with alcohol, ethanol alcohol specifically. They don't talk about that anymore. You just go to the pump and you fill up with unleaded regular. If you look closely around, you'll see that it says E10. And that means that it's 10% ethanol alcohol. Now they're trying to push E15, which is 15% alcohol. And superficially, it sounds like, oh, that's great because it costs less than E10. Sure, it does, but it's also got a lot less energy content than E10. So you don't go as far. And E10 has a lot less energy content than pure gasoline. The mileage loss is significant. It's about 3 to 4% for E10, and it's about 6% or so for E15. So if you factor that out and realize how much you're actually losing over, say, a year, it amounts to a considerable sum of money. And it's just a grift. It's a big grift. Why are we putting alcohol in our gas? Well, because Big Ag makes a fortune from it. The federal mandate that requires this, there's a reformulated fuel, ethanol, renewable energy standard that they use to adulterate the fuel. And it's just a sop to Big Ag. and they present themselves as, oh, we're just your mom and pop farmers, we're making food for you to eat. No, they're not. They're industrial combines that are taking out of circulation feedstocks like corn, which makes food, by the way, more expensive, because instead of feeding cattle, you're feeding the ethanol processing machine that makes this corn squeezins alcohol that they then put in the tank of your vehicle. And by the way, this E15 stuff is really bad news for cars that are not very new, that have not been built and designed to handle that fuel. So, if they do succeed in pushing this out there as a mass market fuel, it's going to accelerate the obsoleting of vehicles that were manufactured before roughly 2015 or so.
By the way, my understanding is the alcohol content in the fuel is bad news for certain parts of the engine, whether it be hoses or I don't even know, tubing. Basically, it's not the same as just good old gasoline. And I had a friend tell me, he goes, I'd avoid that wherever you can, because it will cause premature wear and tear on your engine.
Or something disastrous, actually, for two reasons. It's water attractive. It draws moisture from the air, condensation and so on. And that water gets into your fuel system. Now, if you have an older car, new cars generally have plastic tanks, but if you have an older car with a steel tank, steel fuel lines, not stainless, rust will form inside the tank in the lines. And that stuff will get sucked into your fuel system. And that's a fun thing when that happens. The other thing is that the alcohol itself is corrosive to certain metals, and it's corrosive to certain rubber and plastic parts if they were not designed to handle that particular fuel, including relatively modern fuel-injected cars. You can have fires. If fuel injection operates at a pretty high pressure, 35, 45 PSI, and, if some of those little O-rings and seals and so on in the system get brittle and leak, you get this high pressure fuel spray on your engine, which is very hot, very easy for that to combust if there's a spark. So it's dangerous, and it's also disastrous for older vehicles than that have carburetors. And that includes, by the way, pretty much all outdoor power equipment, lawnmowers, weed whackers, jet skis, all those things. They still use carburetors for the most part. I don't think any of them use fuel injection yet. And carburetors were simply generally not designed to handle that stuff. So the remedy is you have to go through your carburetor with, you have to get a kit that has the ethanol compatible fuels. And it may be that it's only designed for E10, not E15. And then what's next? Are they going to push E30 on us? And, and they probably will do that. And that brings me to one other thing that I wanted to bring up, which I think can't be publicized enough because people aren't really aware of it. You may remember when Trump touted during his first administration about how America is essentially energy independent, how we produce enough oil right here in the good old USA to meet all of the demands that Americans have for oil, right? Remember that? Well, it's true. So how come we're not paying $1.98 for gas? We have all this fuel. We have all this oil. Why is it that gas prices are so high? Well, it's because Trump is exporting the oil that is sourced here in the United States to try to desperately prop up this disastrous war, or rather to treat the effects of this disastrous war on other countries that have to import their oil. And of course, this profits ExxonMobil and Shell and BP, and all these these companies are making bank, fat stacks, as Jesse from Breaking Bad used to say. But isn't it outrageous? Because, I think there might be, leaving aside the moral question, a lot of people would be probably less frustrated and irritated about this war if, in fact, we were paying $1.98 for gasoline, which we ought to be. So what about making America great? Why is it that we're not paying $1.98 for gas? Why are we putting other countries first? Because Trump has to, because he started this stupid, evil war.
Yep. Here's hoping that there is a quick resolution and that we can come back to some degree of normal. I'm not as optimistic as I'd like to be that that's going to happen, but I feel like the Uniparty is fully in control in DC, and it's fighting for control even at the state level in most of the states. So again, I'm going to appeal to the listeners' sense of independence and remind you, nobody is coming to your rescue, especially not your favorite political party. Yeah, take that as you will.
Well, absolutely. The upside is I don't think we're going to have to wait 70 years for the realization to percolate that the government is illegitimate. As it took in the case of the old Soviet Union, for a lot of years, people bought it. They bought it. This is about the collective good, and we're the Soviet Union. Well, it's not going to work now. Particularly with the young. The young have had it up to here, and I think part of the reason that they've had it up to here is because they don't have anything. You take things away from a person, they tend to get angry. You tell people they're never going to have anything, they get even angrier. And that's where the youth are right now. I mean, overwhelmingly, if you look at the demographic breakdown about who's opposed to what's going on right now, people under 30 are like disproportionately opposed to the war and turning completely against Trump, by the way. And, again, another bellwether. You'd think a reasonable man who wasn't addled by his own self-importance would sit up and take notice. Young people did vote for Trump in the last election because they actually bought all of his rap. Now it's turning out that rap was a lie, and the young are furious about it.
And Thomas Massie still has the better part of 6 months to tear that playhouse down.
Yeah, he does. I pray that he is not JFK'd. If he follows through on some of his public utterances about releasing things with regard to the Epstein business, he could probably have a heart attack. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that were to happen, or maybe his car crashes into a tree.
We live in interesting times. I'll just leave it at that.
Right.
Eric, great as always to visit with you. Thank you, my friend.
Appreciate it. Thank you too, Ryan.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.